All right, it's time for story time. So I'm glad you're here. Welcome. The story that is on my schedule, my agenda to share today is actually one about what I don't like about myself and learning to cultivate compassion and tolerance for those things that aren't my favorites. So the story actually begins way earlier than I'm going to start my sharing today. But this started to shift for me when a friend of my middle child, when they were about 3, expressed what was essentially her dislike of some kind of food that I had offered. In which case I said, "What do you think?" And I knew it was different than the kind of food that she ate at home. It was, I don't know, probably a casserole from the Midwest, from my upbringing, that I was sharing for their midday lunch meal or whatever. But her response to my inquiry surprised me. And even to this day, now 15 years later, is still a go-to, probably even the precursor of learning how to reframe from love. And so this little 3-year-old said to me, she kind of cocked her head and put her hand on her hip and she said, "Well, Miss Kimberlin, it's not my favorite." And she was okay with that. She was okay with being honest about what she liked and what she didn't like. Now, truth was, her palate was not very mature. She liked chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. So what I offered her was outside of that. But rather than trying to please me and pretend she liked it, or tell me something that might be easier in the moment, yeah, it's okay, or it's fine, I like it, but could risk having to eat more of it or eat it again if I thought she actually liked it. But the moment was more about embracing my own truth. That was what this little, her name is Maddie, that was what this little girl in my life invited me into, was to own that it's okay not to like things just as they are. And so some of the things that I struggled to like about myself, well, they were often tangibly rooted in things that I could physically point to. That was more comfortable, even as a young person, and especially even now as an adult, I guess, in the sense that I didn't like that I was a small child, teeny tiny small. I wanted to be able to wear clothes that had more shape and design and style than the toddler's clothes that I was wearing into kindergarten, first, and even second grade. I was really so little. I didn't love, in fact, I had a lot of self-loathing about what was very dominant freckles on my forehead, on my face, on my shoulders. And as a new kid, over and over and over again throughout my childhood, I became known as the freckle face kid. And that was like a slur to my little heart. I wanted to be known as me as an individual. But the first thing people noticed was my freckles, and then the association with all of my siblings. I have 6 of them, in which case I kind of got lost in the crowd. So I think what I loathed most, or what was most difficult for me to actually make peace with, was actually this uneasiness that I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be celebrated and to be special. I think all of us do on some level, but I didn't want to be called out. I didn't want to be in charge. I didn't want to be at risk of making a fool of myself. My confidence was no bigger than my shoe size, really, in the sense that I didn't have a sense of what I did that was good or of value. in which case I really didn't know that I mattered at all. And so on the surface, I had identified some things that I didn't like about myself, mostly my appearance, my size, my association, my uniqueness in terms of being an outsider rather than being one that fit in. I can even remember wishing, this is in my teenage years, that I could get a tan because all of my middle school friends could all tan their skin. And so they spent time in the sun in the summertime and would get bronze. And I just looked like a lobster, or worse, a blistered, peeling, scaly lobster. So in that sense, obviously, our identity is often associated with what we look like until we start to know what's on the inside. And I wish that I could say that I outgrew that with the teenage years, but it wasn't there long after that the hair started to turn white. And although much less then than it is now, that was also another swipe at my sense of confidence, my sense of ego, and that I looked older than I was because of the aging white hair. But the real test came when folks just said, just dye it, just color it, just hide the white. And it started to really test my sense of authenticity. I didn't know how to articulate it at that time, but it felt incongruous to pretend to be something that I wasn't, which really came down to wearing makeup to conceal my freckles and coloring my hair to conceal the premature white and gray that was starting to come in. Now, all that said, it was really at its root about not having the confidence, the clarity as a part of that confidence to be myself, to be my authentic self, and to trust that that was enough. So I would love to tell you that I'm so over this today, but I'm not. There's still times where I can hear those taunting calls of, oh, the freckle-faced kid, or so-and-so, yada, yada. Oh, those Murphy kids, there's so many of them, I can't tell them apart, right? That all of that lingers in the back of my head, especially when I'm meeting someone new. Now, it's one thing to be the host, right? And as the owner of my studio, I play host quite a bit, in which case I can fall into a task, a role, an action that I am competent in doing. And that fills that uneasiness until I can see whether or not I can just be. And that's a coping strategy. A coping strategy to help me mitigate, which is fundamentally the root of what I don't like about myself, is the fear that I live with every day. The fear that sometimes shows up as just a need to move or to get space away, to run away, a desire to cry because I don't know what else to do. And so I just got to move that energy. But from a very young age, I learned that it was shameful to be afraid, that somehow I was not good enough if I felt fear. But that's a myth. No one taught me that intentionally. I can pretty much promise you, no one told me that if you're afraid you are not good enough to be here, you should just go home. If you are afraid, that means that you don't have what it takes to hit the ball at the softball team, right? No one ever said that to me. But on the same level, I was affirmed that if you're good, you belong. If you know how to do the things, then you're wanted. And if I didn't know how to do the things, which included being me, then why would I be there? And so I was filled with fear. Fear that showed up in an inability to breathe, which, yes, probably was also contributed by allergies and sensitivities in my environment, but it also, now I understand, has more to do with the tension that I was holding in the diaphragm of my breathing and the constriction of my throat. I tease today might call it my tight assness. And I've endeared myself to the idea that, yeah, I'm kind of a tight ass. I have a lot of practice controlling things because it helps mitigate the fear that lingers. The fear that I believe we all have, and yet some define that as reason to run away, to hide, to not do the things. And others define it as perhaps the reason to do the things, meaning, oh yeah, watch me, I'm going to do it anyway. Either way, fear showing up in our inability to be present is anxiety. How do we overcome anxiety? Courage. Courage. And this is one of the gifts that Brené Brown speaks of in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. That when we embrace our own imperfection, yeah, on the surface, you know, freckles or pimples or funny haircut, if you've ever had a funny haircut, those are all surface and they seem to, you know, be something we can kind of get over. But what about the deeper flaws, the selfishness, the cheating, the perhaps sins of omission or sins of action, depending on your background? There's a reason that in the addiction, the AA process, part of the journey comes by owning our own story, taking account, taking responsibility, and then attempting to make amends to those we've harmed. Now, that's as long as the amends doesn't make things worse. Now, I'm not a participant in AA or any other addiction culture. And yet I have my own addictions. For me, it showed up fundamentally as exercise, something that I could control in order to make myself good enough for wherever I showed up, right? Does it work? No, it's just another thing that causes me anxiety, is that now I have a new level of performance and judgment. What does work is cultivating permission for compassion and being authentic with those intimate people that have earned the right to walk this path with me. And by that, I mean, they've mirrored the authenticity of owning our own stories, owning our own shit, and bringing it to light. And sometimes when that shame cycle starts, when that sense of self-doubt and disappointment or just fear shows up, Brené Brown and her work recommends reaching out, whether it's to a spiritual guide, whether it's a teacher, a friend, a parent, a loved one, someone who can meet you in that moment of anxiety and fear and panic, and help you touch your own heart to choose wisely how you want to go forward, how you want to first be with what is, and then take the next step, the next right action. And that is courage, to move from our hearts into that which is not a guarantee. How many times have I just asked, can I just have a sign? Can I just have a guarantee? I'll be happy to do all of the work that's required if I just know for sure that it's gonna matter. But that's not how life works. Life works when we take risks, wise risks, safe risks, mitigated risks, in order to have an experience which we then digest and learn from, whether it's a successful experience or a not successful experience. Either way, it's about how we interpret that experience to affirm and to clarify who we're being in the world. So I want to share a poem today that really just spoke to me in the sense of being my best full self and recognizing that I'm still a work in process. I had the page saved and then I put the book down. So let me see if I can find it here. A prayer for the soul's healing. And this comes from a book called Dialogue with the Goddess by Cynthia Leah Tootle. Ancient mother who created me, is there room for peace in my busy mind? I am willing, if not yet able, to let go of my story, of my history, of my justifications. I surrender today to your story for me, ancient mother. If I start today being your precious child, can you heal all the scars, all the broken places that I can't even see? I choose today to surrender. I choose today to believe. Help me, ancient mother. My strategy when I was younger was to overcome my failings by trying to compensate, distract, be more than what was expected, to fix myself. Now, that's not to say that we should have permission to be assholes, okay? And that when we do something that is harmful or is in misalignment, then it is our responsibility to make amends, to help facilitate the union, the healing, both for ourselves and the others that we've perhaps harmed. But it's a fool's errand to try to be good at everything or to be so autonomous that we don't need one another. And so when I recognize something that looks like a weakness or a failing or an imperfection, I have now been able to reframe that mindset, to see it as an opportunity to reach out for connection, as opposed to armor up and defend myself from being found out. That imposter's syndrome that I have to perform, and instead that authentic self that allows me to recognize where it is that I want to connect in order to embrace the fullness that is the unity of us all together. So I'm curious as to what your stories, what your not my favorite things in your background and how you're wrestling with them, because it's the wrestling that is the practice, right? When we give up and believe that myth, that's the little death. That's the beginning of the end when it comes to our own blooming and becoming. Take care of you and take care of those around you. Perhaps today you need to reach out. Perhaps today someone will reach out to you, because we're in this together. May you breathe deeply and move freely, labor lovingly, and live vibrantly. Namaste. Any comments? You're welcome.
Yeah, just one that stuck with me the entire time since you said it. I was specifically told fear was not an option because it made me a slang for female genitals.
Yeah.
Because there's babies here.
Yeah.
And all emotion, in fact, other than anger, anything other than anger was weakness and was something to be ashamed of, basically.
Yeah.
And I was going to be forced to be ashamed of it, even if I wasn't feeling that way.
So the consequence, right? When we talk about locus of control, when it's our own inner voice that holds that judgment, it can shatter our identity. In which case we rebuild, right? Oh, I don't have to believe that. I don't know where it came from. But when it's from someone who we trusted, we love, someone who was supposed to be our caretaker, who has taught us something that is not only untrue, but harmful, it can rock the foundation just as much as that internal misalignment of our beliefs, right? even
Yeah.
to the point where it makes it even more difficult to trust others, hence drawing a further wedge between us and the outside world, a protection and defense that, nope, I'm not interested because I can't be trusted. So noticing that voice is just the beginning. Finding its source, its origin story, is then going to help determine how do we pull that apart to choose what gets put back together and what needs to be left alone, left out, because it never belonged in the first place.
Yeah. I have two very specific memories of moments when my world was rocked by someone I thought I knew, and then they turned out to act suddenly very different, just seemingly out of the blue. I'm only just starting to trust that I can share how I really feel about things
Yeah.
in just the last year or two.
Yeah. And practice improves that skill. That's why it's called practice. And incrementally sharing more intimacy or more of those hidden things is why programs like AA and therapy and authenticity, that's why they work. Because that which was in the dark, hidden, stuff down, ignored, festers. And so by bringing it to the light, now there's no more fear of being discovered because it's there. And that in itself is the beginnings of living more fully, because we're not living in this defensive, protective, fearful way. It's just there. Good for you.